This is the subhead. This is exactly the sort of environment which can turn normal people into monsters who then seize control and ultimately destroy nations from within. Over the weekend, I read there's a brand new book out by a very well-known historian who his name is Richard Evans, and he published a trilogy about the rise of Hitler, the Third Reich itself, and the collapse of the Third Reich. Back, I don't know, I think the last book was published in the early 2000s, and he's kind of the heir to rise and fall of the Third Reich. I'm forgetting the author's name, but in any case, and it's just his new book, which is, like I said, just out. In fact, it's out in hardcover. Hitler's People is the title. And what's fascinating is in this book, he says, well, this is a quote from it. He says, and he's talking about the senior levels of the Nazi hierarchy, including Adolf Hitler himself. Although Hitler, he agrees, was a psychopath. But this is what happens when people fall under the spell of a cult leader, essentially. And that cult leader happens to be leading a political cult rather than a religious cult, although this is one that certainly has echoes of religion in it as well. He writes, as individuals, the perpetrators whose lives are recounted in this book were not psychopaths, nor were they deranged or perverted or insane, despite the portrayal of many of them as such in the media and the historical literature. In most of their lives, they were completely normal by the standards of the day. They came overwhelmingly from a middle-class background. There was not a single manual laborer among them. Many of them shared the conventional cultural attributes of the German bourgeois, were well-read, played a musical instrument with some proficiency, painted or wrote fiction or poetry. End quote. So the point, monsters rarely start out as monsters and almost never proclaim themselves as monsters. They are made, to a large extent, by circumstance and opportunity, and most crucially, by a charismatic leader who draws them into what is essentially a political cult. And this book that I read this weekend is just blew my mind. He goes on to say that this is how once deeply indoctrinated into the cult, these relatively normal people, senior leadership of the Nazi Party, he writes, become basically nuts. He writes, the Nazi regime created a framework that encouraged its followers, especially during the war, to commit acts that would have been unimaginable in other circumstances. The regime first dehumanized whole categories of people, including the mentally ill and handicapped, Slavs, gypsies, petty criminals, the asocial and work-shy, and above all, of course, the Jews, then placed at the disposal of its followers means of violence normally beyond the reach of most people. In other words, the power of the state, right? The police power of the state. Then he continues, upending the moral restraints common to all human societies in normal time, made murder, cruelty, even sadism and torture legitimate, even desirable attributes of those who worked for it. And then he talks about America. In the introductory chapter of this book about how these relatively normal people became monsters under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. He writes, the emergence in our own time of a class of unscrupulous, populist politicians who do not care whether what they are saying is true, and the massive growth of the internet and social media have fostered a much more widespread uncertainty about truth, coupled with a disdain for evidence-based statements and experts. And this, he writes, is just a direct echo of Nazi Germany. In fact, he says that it was what's happening in America right now with Trump that caused him to, quote, prompted reflections on my earlier work and provided the opportunity to revisit, in some cases, reconsider. In other words, in his earlier trilogy, this massive 3-book set on the definitive history of the Third Reich, he basically had characterized these people as, psychopathic sadists. And now he's going back and looking at them carefully. I mean, this book is a whole series of biographies. It's like a dozen or more chapters of the senior individuals in the Nazi hierarchy and how they were normal people in normal lives, parents, sons, daughters, family members, had kids, loved their dogs, were nice neighbors, had reasonable careers, and then they fell under the sway of Hitler and they became insane, psychopathic mass murderers. And we're seeing something very similar right now here in America. Now, we haven't yet gotten to the psychopathic mass. We got close to it on January 6th. They nearly hanged the Vice President of the United States and murdered the Speaker of the House. They did murder 4 police officers, and 5 other people died that day. And they sent 174 police officers to the hospital. And this is how Trump is feeding the flames. Over the weekend, there were a number of these Republicans who went on the Sunday shows. Louise and I caught a couple of them, saying, "Oh well, that the truck killing those people in New Orleans, that was a terrorist attack. That guy was a Muslim, and the guy in Las Vegas, that was a terrorist attack, and therefore, and it's all because of Joe Biden's wide open borders," which of course is a lie. There is no wide open borders. Joe Biden had no open border policy. It's a continually repeat. And then they say, and that's why we've got to put Pete Hegseth in, and Tulsi Gabbard and all these whack jobs, and get them in. This is and then Trump comes out and tweets over on True Social. He says, with the Biden open border policy, again a lie. With the Biden open border policy, I said many times during rallies and elsewhere that radical Islamic terrorism, other forms of violent crime will become so bad in America that it will become hard to even imagine or believe. That time has come, only worse than ever imagined. What Biden and his group of election interfering thugs have done to our country will not soon be forgotten. MAGA! Right. This is the rhetoric of radicalization and hate that leads to atrocities. Hitler tells us about this over and over again. We saw this in the United States. Hitler had his Reichstag fire. George W. Bush had 9/11. And what did it do? It led to Abu Ghraib, where Americans, average Americans, contractors and soldiers, were murdering and torturing people in prisons in Iraq and in black sites, and then eventually in Guantanamo. We went nuts. Now, it wasn't on the scale of what, Hitler did with the Nazis, but it should warn us, right? And yet here we are again. Once the mass deportations, the retributive arrests, the lawsuits, the states of emergency are established, it's going to be really hard to stop and slow down. And so this now is the time for politicians, reporters, and people of good faith and conscience to stand up and speak out against this normalization of violence, this monster's playbook of Donald Trump, of lies, fear, and his cult of dehumanization. We must speak out. And it's really important that the media start calling this what it is, rather than sane washing and sanitizing. I'll be right back.